Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Composed, an Ash Park novel, Volume 8, by Meghan O'Flynn, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. The walls are thick with black, the kind of dark that blocks out the world, as it should. Everything feels so loud when it's bright. Creation takes quiet, he knows that now. It takes darkness. And once you pare your craft down to its most fundamental and achingly perfect form, you can release it out into the universe. But not until it's ready. Finished products are a labor of love, of sweat, of blood. Finally, years of musing, of failed attempts, but it's all led here. And he's ready for it, though his hands shake, though his belly feels queasy as if he might vomit. He has already. Twice. No, I'm ready. And he has an audience waiting. He looks back down at the sleek magazine in his hand. The pages flip with a plasticky sound, each model practically screaming with the type of confidence acquired through a surgeon's blade. They are but poorly rendered sketches, more Barbie-esque than beautiful, matte and smooth, but those women can't speak. They're not real. They probably don't exist at all. He squints at the page in front of him. At her long legs, blonde hair, creamy skin, the color of a frog's belly. He frowns and reaches for the floor beside him, for the blade. He starts with her upper eyelid. The first incision goes smoothly, the hiss of steel against flesh, against paper, fair, but it doesn't sound that different from flesh, not really. Or maybe it's that it doesn't feel so different in the wrist. It's hard to tell sometimes what he really means until he writes it down. He's never been great at interacting in the moment, the pressured way his words rush out, half of them not even close to what he wants to say, but just give him a pen or a scalpel. He traces the gentle slope down to the tear duct and watches as it ruptures, the white of the eye, the glorious blue iris freed from its prison. The room is hot, though when the temperature rose he isn't sure. Maybe there's something wrong with him. Is he sick? He might be sick. He moves the blade to the lower lid and begins again. Sweat drips from his nose and onto the page. Plip. He barely notices. In this moment, he's a surgeon. He's a harbinger of perfection. He's a better version of himself. Hiss. The blade pauses as if of its own accord. He sets the tool aside with a clink, but neither that nor the hissing can cover the sound of crying. He ignores it and peels the lower lid away, then swallows hard over a lump that even now rises higher and harder in his throat. No going back now. No going back. He tosses the magazine aside, listens to it rustle like the wings of 100 agitated bats, then suddenly cease as if the entire flock has dropped from the sky, just more victims of a world gone mad. That line, even only in his head, is lovely, but he can't focus on it for long. Can't relish it, because from somewhere below him the cries accelerate, keening and high-pitched and desperate. He stares at the tiny eyeball in his hand, feels its realness in the pads of his shaking fingers. Sweat drips down his spine. The screaming comes again, cutting the silence. No, these women staring at him from the pages are not real. But she is. Chapter 1. The running trail started near the eastern border of Ash Park's downtown strip, but it was nothing like the pretty cement paths of the larger districts. Elsewhere, long curves of gray meandered through lines of foliage that brightened in autumn to brilliant hues that somehow smelled of apple cider and hayrides. This path hooked a jagged zipper between bouts of shabby evergreens missing half their needles, scrubby brush, and sickly groves of bare birches, all currently frosted in snow, then looped lazily along the frozen riverbank as if the path itself were so ashamed of its awfulness it would love nothing more than to drown. Edward Petrosky ran a hand over his jowly face, breath pluming in a cloud that should have been good tobacco, and glared at a cigarette butt frozen to the dirt beside the path. The tech companies, the ones who cleared the path in the first place, hired out to keep it free of debris, but there was always an assorted mess of cans and shards of glass that even the most dedicated landscaper couldn't collect. Hidden slivers that only shone like diamonds when the sun hit them. Now, the slivers glittered dangerously from the ground beneath the iron bench, inches from their victim's toes, twinkling like tears as if the woman sitting there had let them slip from her eyes in the final moments of her life. Where His partner had called from her car, but he hadn't seen her as he tracked down the path toward the water. The burly rook, standing guard behind the bench, was staring at him, raising the hairs on Petrosky's neck. The only people here so far were the first responders, rookies with no more business being at this crime scene than a politician belonged in a church. Petrosky leaned toward the bench, jaw clenched, reserving the right to flip the kid off if he didn't stop that shit. But yelling at the guy would raise red flags, especially if it happened in his first moments back on the job. And there were plenty of other things to worry about. The victim's eyes were half closed in the exhausted stupor of a person just off a 12-hour shift, which seemed like a small mercy. Subdued. Accepting. Excessive mascara held her lashes in unnatural spikes beneath thin curves of blue eyeliner and a darker purple eyeshadow, all of it overdone but painstakingly applied. Long, thick hair fell in a wave of onyx over one bare shoulder, glossy and speckled with ice and the occasional wayward snowflake, all the more striking against her brilliantly yellow sundress. Average weight, but something about the dress was wrong, like her body was lopsided beneath, but perhaps it was merely the way she was sitting, and it appeared the hem was crooked. Might be rigor, though. Her dark flesh, too, was splattered with snow. She'd been dead for some time, grown cold enough for the ice to stick to her skin. Needles prickled beneath his shoulders. Familiarity. Did he know the victim? He racked his brain, but he could not place her. Maybe a working girl, even if the outfit was a strange choice. Too prissy, too proper, but the dress wasn't made for a Detroit winter unless you were advertising what was underneath. Even then, walking the streets in that, she would need a coat. But that makeup. Name's Anna Patel, 24 years old, the rookie Flatfoot was saying from his spot behind the bench, forcing Petrosky to glance up. Some asshole with blonde hair and a baby face that didn't belong on top of the guy's stocky frame. He probably did CrossFit, or worse, yoga. Missing 15 days as of this morning. The kid inhaled and blew out his breath hard and fast, a sigh on crank, probably meant to convey what a shame. But Petrosky's fists tightened. Something about the kid's presence bothered him. His face, or maybe the way he'd greeted Petrosky. "So how are you today, detective? It has to be hard dealing with the worst of the worst cases, right?" Petrosky turned away from the kid, from the victim, and squinted into the bitter wind. Directly in front of the bench, a clearing in the trees exposed the river, ice glittering dangerously at the shoreline, a thin line of reddish-orange slashing the horizon like a wound. No buildings visible on the other side, just sheets of crusted ice, so the killer wasn't watching now. All alone. He'd left her all alone. "Was this the last thing you saw, honey?" The snow littered the bench on either side of her body, and the ground beneath her bare toes had not been disturbed by a struggle. No cuts on her feet from the glass that he could see, though dark lines bisected the skin of her ankles and wrists, most likely ligature. Her hands and feet appeared unmarked. If she'd been alive when the killer laid her out here, there would be some sign of it, a wound from a final defensive action. And the rookie had said she'd been missing 15 days. He didn't keep someone for 2 weeks just to kill them quickly. He felt the truth of that in his bones. "He took his time," Petrosky muttered, turning back, still ignoring the rook's question, though that didn't stop the punk from staring at him expectantly. Why was he still here? He forced his voice to remain steady. "You got something else you could be doing?" The kid grunted, half surprise, half irritation, but at least he backed off and headed up the hill behind the bench. No prints near that snowy stretch. They'd already looked. Along the path, evergreen boughs hung heavy with last week's snow over the barren branches of birch and the occasional poplar. That had to be the way the killer had come. But the only entrance to the path was down a steep set of stairs. No good way to get a body here with a wheelbarrow. He'd still checked for tire marks on his way down. "How'd you do it, fucko?" Petrosky drew his gaze back up the path, past scrubby bushes that could hide anything, including the piece of evidence they'd need to find this asshole, and... "About damn time, Jackson." His partner was leaning toward him, leather gloves on, cream earmuffs secured against her head, her closely shorn black hair shimmering in the barely there dawn. Coat the color of an angry bruise, the top button open enough that he could see her black suit underneath. He'd taken to wearing a suit jacket over his t-shirts, but she'd always put his wardrobe to shame. Even her face was more polished, set in the hard, determined lines of a woman who wasn't about to take anyone's shit. Her boots thunked against the ground. The noise reverberated through the trees and into his brain. He could almost imagine the sound was from their killer. But it wasn't. Couldn't be. That'd be far too easy. So what did they know? The killer had to be strong enough to carry the body up the walk to this bench and had probably known the path was the one place kept salted year-round by those crazy tech people. People who spent all their time working indoors and believed everyone could do with some fresh air, according to the press release they'd put out when they paved the path. Fucking hipsters and their community outreach that didn't really help the folks who needed it. Who the hell would run in the winter anyway? Then again, he didn't understand running in the summer either. And no one had been running last night, at least not by choice. Definitely not Anna Patel. Poor girl. He forced himself to bend nearer, though his back creaked like an old rusted car door. The scent of wet earth and the metallic stink of blood bit his nostrils. He could almost imagine she was asleep, her thick foundation covering the death pallor, but her mouth gave it away. Her lips were painted a brilliant bubblegum pink, the outline as perfect as the rest of her makeup, but her mouth was swollen, angry even in death. Was that pus? Congealed gore clung to the innermost part of her lower lip beneath her large front teeth. With all the swelling, the blood, he'd have expected to see crooked cracks, splintered incisors, the result of blunt force trauma to the face, a curb stomping maybe, yet each tooth was perfectly aligned with the one beside it. He leaned closer. The sockets where the teeth were rooted. That was the source of the injury, a mess of frozen gore and mutilated jaw. He straightened with his grunt as Jackson stopped at his side. We got a crazy fucking dentist or what? Petrosky pulled his hat tighter over his ears, the tips of his fingers numb with cold. His partner seemed to be faring better. Even with the sun barely over the horizon, icicles still clinging to the underside of the trees, Jackson was squatting as if her joints weren't frozen in the least, peering at the body as if no time had passed at all since they'd last worked together. He liked her better for it. Not sure on the dentist thing, but he's definitely worried about aesthetics, she said. Looks like he painted her nails. He had, the same neon pink color as her lips. They would have chipped in the struggle if she'd had them done ahead of time, at some point over the last 2 weeks at least. He drew his eyes back to Anna's face, the carefully applied eyeliner, the rouge on her cheekbones. Not a smudge. He had to be the one who put the makeup on her, too, dressed her up after the fact. Maybe we'll get some trace. And the way her hands were crossed, one over the other so politely in her lap, that was a sign of remorse. Was the killer someone she knew? I hope he came up from behind and blindsided you. I hope he made it fast. But from the terrible state of her mouth, the pus that indicated infection that would have taken a week to fester, the killer had wanted her to suffer. Petrosky crouched, eye level with the woman on the bench. The woman's half-lidded eyes stared past him, gaze dull, blank, and after 15 days, finally, blessedly relieved.